All right. Okay, here we go. We're going to focus our attention now on the next step in the exegetical process for the prophetic genre. So we have looked at so far quite a bit of background information when we talked about who the prophets were, why study prophecy. We talked about key hermeneutics. So we covered quite a bit of background information to prepare us for studying the prophets. So make sure that you go back in your notes of those first 7 or 8 sessions that, make sure you watch the videos if you weren't able to be a part of class, to get that background information, because that's very important and that will help us moving forward. A couple of weeks ago, we started in the process for how to study and preach the prophetic books. And these first 3 steps, again, are the same for studying any book of the Bible, except for the Psalms. But every other book of the Bible, we want to study the book as a whole first, because it is a book written by a specific author to a specific audience for a specific purpose at a specific time. And so we want to understand the book as a whole. So these first 3 steps are the same, whether it's a narrative, whether it's a poetic, whether it's prophetic, or whether it's like an epistle. Again, except for the book of Psalms, as we talked about in the last module, since the Psalms are a collection of independent poems. So that's a little different. But every other book in the Bible, we want to study the book as a whole. And so the first step was reading several times, making observations. A question came up earlier this morning about the observation step and in Zechariah for your assignment, and how many repeated words do we look for? Do we look for the whole book? Yes, I want you to read the whole book, make observations for the whole book. In that assignment, you only need to make 5 observations or so for each chapter and ask a question or 2. And for repeated words, it's repeated words in the whole book, but just look for 4 or 5 key, or most common words or synonyms that are repeated in the book. I want you to be familiar with the whole book. Okay, and so that first assignment is make observations of the whole book. And then the second assignment is the background context for the book. And you'll find a lot of helpful information in Ezra 1-6 and Zechariah chapter 1. Also, Haggai gives you a lot of information of the background of the book. So make sure to use those as a resource. And then today, I want to turn our attention to the third step, which again is the same thing we did for epistles, the same thing we did for narrative, the same thing we did with the book of Proverbs, and that is look at the literary context. Now, remember, when we talk about context for a book, there's 2 kinds. Just to review, there's the background context. That's the setting of the book. That's the author's circumstances, and we could even add the recipients to that, the author and recipient, their circumstances. Then there's a second kind of context, and that is the literary context, or some might refer to it as surrounding context, or contextual flow is another way it's described. But basically, that is what is written in the book. That are the words that the author has given us. It's his flow of thought. So we have the author's background, the setting for the book. That's the background context. And then we have what the author actually said and his flow of thought as he goes from one point to another point to another point. And that's no different for the prophetic books. They have arranged their sermons, they've arranged their books with a flow of thought. All right. Now, that flow of thought may differ between genres. You may have a narrative genre, and then it'll switch to a prophetic message, and then back to narrative, and then maybe a psalm. So certainly the genres used in the prophetic books can vary, but there's always a flow of thought. within the book. So keep that in mind. If you're again, just we're reviewing here in the beginning, but remember the author's flow of thought you can think of as a series of thoughts, a main point. So there's one point that he makes, and then another point that's connected to it, and then another point that's connected to it. That's a flow of thought, like a river. And so we can represent those units of thought by these boxes. And in epistles, these boxes were paragraphs. So we'd have paragraph 1, and then that would lead to paragraph 2, and that would lead to paragraph 3, right? And so on, right? And each of these paragraphs had a particular point. When we looked at poetry, right, we had stanzas. So we'd have stanza 1 that would lead then to stanza 2, and again, just the same pattern to stanza 3, etc., where each of the stanzas were connected together. They each communicated a particular point. Now, in a poem, those points are communicated using poetic language, but it's still the same idea. There's still instruction being given, and it's building. The author's building that instruction. So he says one thing, and that connects to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. In a narrative, you could think of within the narrative, within the story, we have the scenes that sort of connected together in a similar fashion, with each scene presenting a certain event or situation that was part of the story, but they were linked together. Okay. And so and then you might have, in a larger narrative book, you might have, story 1, and that then leads to the second story and the third story. And these are not independent stories, but they're all linked together. And so you want to keep that in mind. Well, it's the same with the prophetic books. They're not just random scattered thoughts that the prophet throws into a book, or just random sermon statements from his sermons that he puts together, but usually in a prophetic book you will have usually there's one of two styles. One approach is sort of a narrative style, and then with prophetic messages interspersed. Like, for example, in the book of Isaiah, it's like that. There's a lot of narrative in Isaiah, events that take place, and then in the midst of those, we have Isaiah delivers these sermons. It's the same in Jeremiah. He gives the same approach. And so Hosea is another one. The first 3 chapters are narrative. They tell a story about Hosea's life and marrying a prostitute named Gomer. And then the rest of his book really is connected to that story of his life, because God uses it to illustrate the message he has Hosea preach to the people of Israel. And so chapters 4 through 14 are all it's a collection of his sermons that he delivers to the people of Israel. And each of those sermons are linked together in terms of a flow of thought. And then within each of those sermons, there's a flow of thought, as each message addresses a particular issue. And so we see that like in epistles. If you think of, say, 1 Corinthians, right? Paul addresses several different topics in that letter. He talks about unity. He talks about suing one another. He talks about someone who's in immorality. He talks about the resurrection. He talks about the spiritual gifts within the body. He talks about what else is there? The chapter on love, right? So there's all these particular topics that Paul delivers in that letter, but they're connected together. They're not randomly expressed, but there's a flow of thought to it. So it's the same for the prophetic books, okay? And let me, this is essentially what I was just saying. So to put together the literary context, we have to identify, each section of the book and the genre of that section. As I mentioned earlier, the challenge with prophetic books is they mix the different genres. So here's a couple of examples. We have Jonah, which is a narrative primarily, right? Chapter 1 is a story with Jonah disobeying God, and he's on the Mediterranean. There's a storm. Then in chapter 2, it's a psalm, which Jonah declares in response to God's delivering him from, or saving him from drowning. Then in chapter 3, it's back to the narrative where he is
Good morning.
in Nineveh. Good morning, Eric. Good morning, Edwin. And then in chapter 4, it's still part of the narrative. So we have a mixture of narrative and then this psalm that's inserted. But the psalm's directly connected to the flow of the story. It's not just a random poem that the author put in there, but it's connected to the flow of thought, right? He's thrown into the sea in chapter 1, and God delivers him. And so there's this psalm of praise in chapter 2, and then he returns to doing what God told him to do, to go to Nineveh in chapter 3. Habakkuk is another example where Habakkuk is really a dialogue in the first 2 chapters between Habakkuk and the Lord. And really that's a style of narrative, right? Dialogue is part of the narrative approach, but it's a dialogue using poetic language. And then the 3rd chapter is a psalm that Habakkuk writes in response to the first 2 chapters. So there's a flow of thought there. There's a back and forth in the dialogue between Habakkuk and the Lord, and then Habakkuk's response in the 3rd chapter, which he chooses to give in the form of a psalm. All right, so those particular books show us there can be a mixture of genre within the book that we have to be aware of when we try to identify the author's flow of thought. All right, so for example, in Habakkuk, we're going to want to break it down by, let me look at Jonah first. For Jonah, when we hit the narrative parts, we're going to want to break it down by scene. And actually, chapter 2 could function as a scene, right? It's the belly of the fish. So chapter 1, the scene is on the Mediterranean. Chapter 2, the scene is in the belly of the fish. And then chapter 3 is at Nineveh. And chapter 4 is outside Nineveh. So we can't even break that whole story down into scenes. But when you study chapter 2, you're going to also need to add the poetic, looking at the poetic elements. But there's still a flow of thought. There's still a point to chapter 1 that's connected to a point made in chapter 2, that's connected to a point made in chapter 3, that's connected to a point made in chapter 4. And all of that together presents the message of the book. Okay? It's the same in Habakkuk. There's always a flow of thought in all these books, even if different genres are used within the book. Now, most prophetic books are mainly containing sermons. Most of them, some of them are just all one sermon. Joel, as I mentioned last week, I think Joel, Nahum, Obadiah, which we're going to look at today. Any others? It's just is Malachi? I can't remember. No, it's not.
Haggai.
What's that?
Haggai.
Haggai's actually 3 sermons he gives at different times, but it's all sermon. Most of it's sermon. So most of the prophetic books are contained. A bulk of the book is sermons. And remember, sermons, because the prophets were primarily preachers, and so they would preach these sermons to address a specific issue. And so sermons, remember, are instructional by nature, like epistles. Okay, they're exhortations, they're commands, they're instruction that's being given. And so we can identify the author's units of thoughts by paragraph, just like we did in the epistles. Even when poetic language is used, that doesn't change the fact that he's expressing particular points within paragraphs. So you'll see that in the example that we go through together today in Obadiah. Okay, so if you'll remember, way long time ago now, it seems like forever, in Module 1. You guys remember Module 1? That was a long time ago. Module 1, we talked about how do you identify the author's flow of thought. And I gave you just a way to summarize each paragraph in the epistle to do that. So here were the steps that we used way back in module 1, where we identify the paragraph limits. So that is, identify what are the paragraphs within the book. The translations are very helpful to us in that step. Then the second step is, once you've identified each of the paragraphs, it's now, okay, as I focus on one paragraph, I want to identify what's the main sentence in that paragraph. Usually it's near the beginning. And then after that, we need to identify what are the linked, connected words, the related words within that paragraph. Are there words that are repeated, or the phrases repeated, or the synonyms that are used to express a similar idea, or maybe contrast? So we're looking for the linked words. And then what we do is we take the main sentence, we look at those linked words that the author, there's a repetition there or connection, and we combine those together to come up with the author's point for that paragraph. And we summarize that point in our own words. And I used 10 to 20 as a guide for that particular sentence. So we're going to do that again. You're going to do that typically for the prophetic books, especially when we are looking at sermons. And so what I want to do is apply this to the book of Obadiah. All right, I've been asking you to read this, get familiar with it. So what I'd like to do this morning is I want to give you a chance to do the paragraph summary for the book of Obadiah. So you're going to need to have a Bible with you as well, so you can refer to that. But before we do that, I want to have us read through Obadiah together, and then I'll let you know what we're going to do. So first, let's read Obadiah. I've broken it up just into 5 verses or 4 verses apiece. So we'll start with Pastor German. If you could read the first section here, verses 1 to 4, and then Eric, if you could read the next section, 5 to 8. Joshua 9 to 12, Edwin 13 to 17, and Manuel, if you could read 18 to 21, okay? So let me
start with me.
Go ahead, German.
Can you roll down, Pastor Tim? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The visions of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom, we have heard a report from the Lord, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise and let us go against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations, you are greatly despised. The arrogance of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the cliffs of the rock, in the loftiness of your dwelling place, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to earth? Though you build high like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord.
Verse 5, can you roll up, Pastor Tim?
Yes.
If thieves came to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you will be ruined. Would they not steal only until they had enough? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave some gleanings? Oh, how Esau will be ransacked and his hidden treasures searched out. All the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They who eat your bread will set an ambush for you. There is no understanding in him. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau?
Then your mighty men will be dismayed, O Tenma, so that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. Because of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune, and do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress.
Verse 13. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster. Do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down their fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. For the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head, because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed. But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their possessions.
Can't hear you, Emmanuel. Is your microphone working? Uh-oh. We have a pause.
Deliver. Deliver.
Brother, naka-unmute.
He's not muted. I think his microphone's not working.
Find substitutions, Pastor Tim.
Di mi
Ilisi,
Still can't hear you.
ilisi og sure microphone, brother.
Oh. There, try that. Oh, still can't hear you. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask John if he could go ahead and read then, since Emmanuel's having microphone trouble there. John?
Verse 18, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be a stubble. And they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau. For the Lord has spoken. Then those of the Negev will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, also possess the territory of Ephraim, and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. And the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as the Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the cities of the Negev. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. What we want to do now is basically break down this message. This is all one sermon from Obadiah. And there are units of thought here in this sermon. There are a few paragraphs here where he expresses those particular units of thought. As I mentioned here, Obadiah is a sermon. So question is, well, okay, what are the paragraphs? How do we identify those paragraph limits? And what I like to do at the beginning, at least, is use the translations as a guide. And so, for example, each translation will show you the paragraph limits. So, for example, let me just take you to, we did this in class, again, way back for Unit 1, I believe. So I know it's been some time. Let's see, where are we? Here we go. So here, for example, is, oh, what's going on? Sorry, give me a second here to. Let's try that. All right, there we go. So basically, most of the translations will identify paragraphs by putting a space between each paragraph. So if I look at the New American Standard Version here, if it'll let me scroll. Notice between verses 9 and 10, there's a space. You see that? And then if we go down further.
Pastor Tim, there are 10 paragraphs in New.
Excuse me?
10 paragraph, I think, in New King. 10 paragraph, many paragraphs in New King James Version.
Yeah, I'll show you in a minute. All right, this is the New American Standard. So there was one break at verse 9, and then notice here's another space at verse 14. And then I think, yeah, that's it till the end. So the New American Standard has 3 paragraphs it identifies. We can look at the New King James. My computer is running pretty slow right now. Okay, here's the New King James. Let me, I'm going to shrink it a little bit. Wow, this is really going. Okay, so here the New King James has a paragraph, basically verse 1, and then verses 2 through 4. It breaks it, and then
New King James 10 paragraph.
5 to 9. Then 10 and 11. So, but you can see, right, the spaces, right?
12, 14.
Yeah, 10 to 11, then 12 to 14, 15 and 16, and then
17, 18,
17.
19, 21.
Yeah, so there's a lot of paragraphs there. I think that might be too many. The NIV, if we look at the NIV here, I think I pulled that one up. That's this one. The NIV has oh, my verse numbers are missing here. Where are my verse numbers?
In ESV, 5 paragraphs.
Yeah, there's quite a few in the ESV as well. And so that,
NIV 5 paragraphs.
yeah, the ESV I have here can look. The ESV has verse 1 through 4 as one paragraph after the introduction, the vision of Obadiah, and then it's verses 5 to 9, right? Wait, whoops. 5 to 7, right? And then verses 8 and 9. Notice there's a space between 9 and 10. And then that's 10 to 14. There's a space right after 14. 15 to 18. There's a space. And then that's it. So yeah, there's what? That's 6 paragraphs in the ESV translation. But then as I as I mentioned, the New American Standard, they just have 3 paragraphs in the New American Standard translation. All this is to say that you notice the translations, each of them is a little bit different. And so you can use your translation as a starting point for identifying each of the paragraphs. And then after you do it, you may look and notice, well, you know, these 2 paragraphs really are a similar idea. They should maybe be 1 paragraph. Or maybe you have a larger paragraph from the translation and you decide, you know, I can see 2 different points here in this paragraph. So, but we just start with one of the translations as a guide, and then we can come back and change it as we get more familiar with each of the paragraphs. I typically use the New American Standard, so we're going to use that just for this exercise. But if you had the ESV or the New King James, you might have start at a little different place, and that's okay. All right. Right now, our point is just trying to summarize the main point in each of the paragraphs, and we just need to start somewhere. And so I usually start with, I have found normally the New American Standard and the ESV are usually pretty good at identifying the paragraphs, because again, we're not, the original text doesn't have paragraphs. All right, that's an interpretation from the translators. The original Hebrew, original Greek, the books weren't written in paragraph form. They weren't written in chapter and verse either. That came later. So those are just extra to the Bible. They weren't part of the original manuscript. All right. So we're going to just use the New American Standard as a guide here for identifying the paragraphs. So what I want you to do is we're going to take these and just take, it's kind of a big paragraph, huh? Let's see, but that's okay. What I want you to do is take this verse 1 to 9 as 1 paragraph, and I want you to identify what the main sentence. And I would say for this, start with the prophetic utterance here in verse 2. Okay. And just summarize what the point is of these verses 2 through 9. In other words, what's the main sentence? And then look for anything in this paragraph that's linked together, either repeated idea, repeated phrase, a repeated word, or synonyms. Just what seems to be a focus or of the author, what's linked together, what's connected in this statement. And so that'll be those 2 things you want to look for. So use a Bible that you have on the side and just fill in the information here. The main sentence, again, look for, it's going to be near the beginning of verse 2. All right. This is the beginning of the Obadiah's message here to Edom. All right. So look for the main sentence near the beginning, and then look for any linked words or phrases or ideas. So just try it. We'll come together and talk about it together. I'll give you some time to do it on your own. Okay. Questions? All right. Why don't you go for it? Focus on verses 2 to 9. Identify the main sentence and then the linked words, phrases, and ideas. Okay. And I'll be around. If you have a question, just ask. I'll be right here. All right. I'm going to put this together. Okay. All right. As I said, the first verse really is sort of an introduction to the fact that there's a message going to be declared here. But really that message begins at verse 2. That's why I wanted you to focus your attention there. So as we look there, what seems to be the main sentence? Anyone want to?
First
of all, Pastor Tim, verses 1 up to 9 is in the narrative form.
Well, really only the first statement, right? Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. Then it's a sermon after that. Okay, so it's not a story. He's not telling a story here. He is declaring the word of the Lord concerning Edom.
Pastor Tim, it
So
start in verse 2. Behold, is up. I think a hyperbole.
It's the main. It's
Yeah.
the main.
The word behold.
It's the main.
The interjection, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good. That's a poetic device.
Yes.
And then what's the first thing he says?
I will make you small.
I will make you small.
Yeah, among the nations. Okay, let's do this.
On the
It's
nation.
fine.
Yeah, figure of speech. Yeah.
Declaration of judgment.
Yes. Declaration.
Despise, bringing you down, ruin, ransack, ambush, destroy,
Okay,
slaughter.
let me do this. Hold on a second. Let me move things around here. I want to put these two next to each other. I think this will make it easier here. All right, I'm going to put this. No. Sorry, give me a minute here. All right, do that. Okay, now let's do this. Okay, try this. So you should see the scripture text on your left, and then I'm gonna take notes here on the right side of the screen. So I think that the main sentence, or at least the initial sentence, he says, "I will make you small." And as Ramil said, this will be a message of judgment. Okay. Then when we look for connected, repeated, linked words, ideas, what do you guys have for that?
Then,
Sir Tim, is that
ruin.
I will bring you down?
Sorry?
Is it the same with I will bring you down in verse 4?
Judgment.
Oh, I will make you small. I will bring you mean similar to I will make you small?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, he repeats this idea, I think, throughout the paragraph here. So we could have, make you small, is similar, bring you down in verse 4. Okay, those are linked together. Kent, what were you gonna say?
Also verse 8, Pastor Tim.
The link words or praise ideas is
Verse
is
8 also.
ruin, ransack, ambush, destroy, slaughter.
Yeah, those are all connected ideas, right? This is a pretty significant, strong language, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, somebody.
Because of arrogance and loftiness. In verse 3.
Verse 3, what?
Arrogance and loftiness.
Yeah, there's arrogance. Loftiness, those go together. High in verse 4, it's kind of the same idea.
High.
Your home high, your nest among the stars, verse 4.
Yeah, high among the stars.
You live among the cliffs.
That's hyperbole.
Maybe.
Set your nest among the stars.
Actually,
Set your nest among the stars.
Yeah,
that's hyperbole.
Nest among the stars is figurative, certainly, right? Nobody lives up in the stars except maybe angels are up there. But you live in the clefts of the rock, that could be a literal statement. But those are connected. This idea of high, dwelling high, being high, and it's a connection with arrogance and loftiness, right?
Yes.
then you, right, you are arrogant, you are lofty, you live in high places, but I'll bring you down. I'll bring you down from where you live, and I'll bring you down in your pride. Kind of the connection there. Okay, any others that you see?
About
Also,
verse
Pastor
7.
Tim,
What's that, Eric?
you are greatly despised. Verse 2.
Okay, connected to what?
To
I'll make you
ruin, destroy, despise.
Small and despised.
Okay,
Verse 1.
Down,
Verse
bring
2.
you down.
make you small. Okay, yeah, we could put that. Yeah, despised. Okay, good. All right, good.
Verse 2.
Ransack, Pastor Tim.
About verse 7, Pastor Tim.
Okay.
Ransack, verse 8, verse 6.
Yeah, we have
Esau will
ruin,
be
ransack,
ransacked.
destroy. Yeah, we've got those connections.
Treasures searched out.
Okay. John, what did you say?
Verse 7, Pastor Tim. All the men at peace will deceive and overpower you.
Okay, and where else do we see? What's
Deceive and
that?
overpower.
Oh, overpower. Okay, like destroy, in with that group of. Yeah, good, good. Okay, I think that's a pretty good. It captures a lot of the linked words, I think, pretty well. And we could even connect, really make this two groups almost. These all sort of connect, right? To make you small, bring you down, greatly despise. Those are connection with ruin, destroy, ransack. And then arrogance, loftiness, high. Those could be linked too to among the stars. So as we think about this, how would you summarize then this first paragraph? What would you say is the main point, just in your own words?
Declarations of God's judgment to Edom.
Would you say the conditions of God's judgment?
Declaration. Yeah. The declarations of
Declaration, I'm
of-
sorry.
yeah,
Declaration
of God's
God.
judgment to Edom.
Judgment on Edom. Okay. Now, certainly this expresses judgment. Now, how would we incorporate these linked words and ideas? All right.
God exterminate Edom because of his ego.
Okay, that's another. God exterminate will
and
Edom
also Pastor Tim.
because of his
Because of his
pride. Yeah. Eric?
13, God will humble the proud.
Okay, but here we want to be specific. He's talking to Edom, so we're not looking for principles here yet. We're just looking for the specific point being made. So certainly it's Edom being judged, but it's the extent of the judgment we should also include and the reason for the judgment, right?
That's our the reason.
Yeah, because we have judgment here on Edom. That's clear, right?
The reason is verse 3, their pride.
3 to
Yeah.
9, reason of the judgment.
Because he repeats it, right? Arrogance,
Their
loftiness.
pride, their arrogance. That's the
Right.
reason why God judged Edom.
And then the extent of the judgment is also mentioned here, right? Ruin, make you small, slaughter, right? That's where all those words come from.
Destroy.
Destroy. So how would we put these three ideas together in a sentence?
Reason why. Reason.
God's complete judgment on Edom.
God's complete judgment on Edom for her
Edom.
arrogance. How about that?
I think not just arrogance, Pastor Tim, because
Well, we're just looking at this.
yeah.
him.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Because of the arrogance, because of his arrogance.
Yeah, something like that, I think, right?
Up-
Or you
up-
could say it this way.
Pastor Tim, God's punishes Edom's pride.
Okay,
Edom's pride.
that's a short version. I put, but again, remember, you have to, what kind of punishment? It's not just punishes, it's a extreme, right? Harsh
Adjective, yeah.
judgment of Edom, something like that. I put something like this: God will bring down, because that's the picture here, bring down the arrogant Edomites in thorough, I put thorough judgments. Okay, because we want to, obviously judgment's the theme here, but we want to identify and note that there's a lot of emphasis on this is going to be a strong judgment. And also he mentions often the pride of Edom, the loftiness of Edom, the Edomites. So we want to also include those two ideas here. So I think these sentences here capture it pretty well. Okay, or God will exterminate Edom, because, so we wouldn't just say God. So the point here is this: you wouldn't just say God's judgment on Edom. Okay, certainly that's the theme of the paragraph, but we want to present it in a complete sentence that gives us the whole idea, because he doesn't just declare judgment here, he gives the reason for the judgment, and he describes the severity of the judgment. You guys see that? So you want to put all of that into the sentence, because that's all of what the author seems to be emphasizing. Pastor Ramil, did you have something to say?
What?
Brother Sandy, did the chicken have any comments?
Yet, I'm just looking verse to verse from chapter 3, 4 down to 9, and I think I found some important principle. Just in verse 3 to 4 is the cause of the judgment of God to Edom, pride because of their safety and security. I just try to note that.
Yeah.
Then verse 5 to 6 is the pride of their hidden treasure. Verse 7, pride of their allies, pride of their wisdom, pride of their military power. Like that. I don't know it's right.
Yeah. Well, again, you can see sort of there's when we look at a paragraph, it's going to address or center or repeat or focus on some common ideas. And so what we want to do is just try to see, is there something that he mentions all through the paragraph? And certainly their pride, right? Or something like that is mentioned many times. Also, the extent of the judgment, right? He repeats the severity, the words he uses, how Esau will be ransacked. The men will overpower you, will set an ambush for you, destroy, right? So all these words are connected together. So we just try to incorporate them in our paragraph summary. So these, like I said, I think the one I highlighted here kind of captures that. We don't want to just say something simple like God's judgment on Edom. That's not the full picture of this point he's making. Okay. He's also expressing also need to express the reason for the judgment, because that's given, repeated in the paragraph, and also the extent of the judgment. Both of those are repeated. So that tells us that's a key idea from the author here. Any questions on this? Can you guys see that? We're just trying to collect what seems to be his focus by what he repeats, what he dwells on. Any comments or questions before we go to the next one?
So the whole scope Pastor Tim, with the idea. Not all, that the principle is not yet included in this process, Pastor Tim.
What principle? No. Oh, you mean no? We're not looking for the timeless truths here. All we're doing is just what did the author, if we were to summarize, what was the author's point of this paragraph to his audience?
Okay.
Okay. We'll
Okay.
get to the timeless truths later, later on in the process. Right now, we're just looking at what's the author's flow of thought. So we're just trying to summarize his main point. Let's do that now for verses 10 to 14. This is a little shorter paragraph, so hopefully it won't take as long. Why don't you guys do the same process now for verses 10 through 14? Look for the main sentence. Usually it's at the beginning there. And then again, the same thing. Look for any linked, repeated, focused words or phrases or ideas. All right. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Verses 10 to 14. Okay. Let's go ahead and do verses 10 to 14. What seems to be the main sentence here?
Verse 10.
Yeah, verse 10, I think, right? Which is,
Violation is the
Verse
brother.
10.
yeah,
Verse 10.
you will be covered with shame because of violence to your brother, right?
And Pastor Tim,
Cut off forever.
the violation of their brother was spoke by Obadiah in verse 11, 12, 13, 14. The details in chapter 11, they stood withholding assistance in verse 11.
With doing what in verse 11?
They stood
Aloof.
withholding assistance, verse 11.
Yeah, I mean, there's notice the focus on, right? Carried off his wealth, entered his gate, gloat, destruction, misfortune, right? You see all those connected together?
Destruction, distress, disaster, calamity.
All right, those all related to Israel, right? Or Judah, Israel. Right, their disaster, their destruction.
Destruction.
And then what else seems to be connected or repeated here?
The word,
Excuse me, Pastor Tim.
the word do not.
Yeah, do you see that? Do not
Verse 12.
repeat it. Do not gloat. Do not boast. Do not rejoice.
Pastor Tim.
Do not loot.
Do not loot.
And
Pastor Tim, how about
what's that,
Pastor
Jesse?
Tim, how about the sentence, you will be cut off forever? Could it be could it not be the main sentence also?
Yeah, you'll be covered, and because there's a conjunction, so that's a good, and you will be cut off. There's two things. In verse 10.
It's a little bit heavier, a little bit witty.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Or I think I think the sentence convey the whole message of the book. You will be cut off forever.
Yeah.
Complete judgment to Edom. Yeah.
So exterminate.
Okay, anything else you see connected here, linked in these
In the
verses?
day. Repetition in the day.
Oh yeah, in the day, right? Or on the day.
On the day.
Yeah, that's repeated many times, huh? One.
Brother Jacob.
Yeah, notice
Brother
too,
Jacob, sons of
Brother
Judah, my people.
Jacob, Judah.
Verse 10.
Yeah.
Verse 12, brothers,
my people.
Verse 12, the sons of Judah, and then my people, verse 13.
Okay, good. All right, so put these ideas together then, in this paragraph, verses 10 to 14, how would you summarize it?
The reason that
The
God
reason.
God
judged
justifies the judgment for Edom.
Okay, God justifies
Justification for judgment of Edom.
his judgment upon Edom. Okay. Yeah, we still have the theme of judgment, right? You'll be covered in shame, you'll be cut off. But notice here, there are more specifics to the reason. It's not just their pride that he talked about in the first paragraph. What is the issue in the second paragraph?
they're doing
Indifference.
Violence.
Yeah, against
Yeah,
who?
violence. Yep, violence.
violence,
Against Judah.
Yes,
judgment.
violence against Judah, or
Judah.
right?
Against the brother Jacob.
Yeah, there was a specific issue here, right? It's not just against Israel as a nation, but notice the idea of being a brother, right? You see that repeated? Brother Jacob, Brother's Day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brother.
Okay.
So Pastor Tim, I try. God's equal judgment do not excuses blood relationship.
Relationship.
God.
Yeah.
Say
Do
it
not
right.
excuses. Yeah. Do not excuses blood relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, there was
That is
something.
principle. That is principle already, not summary.
That's the idea here is it's not just violence against Judah, but because it's even their brother, right?
Their brother. Yeah.
That's the idea that they took advantage
Betrayal.
of their brother.
Betrayal against their brother.
All right, which would explain why in this sermon, in this book, right, he uses Esau and Jacob interchangeably with Israel and Edom. So there's an intentional link being made to, it's more than just two nations, but they're both connected, in their history as to the brothers, Esau and Jacob. And so this was more than just violence against a nation in general. This was violence against a nation they should have been looking out for and caring for.
The fighting start in the womb.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So, yeah, I think the summary I put here, God will judge Edom for their harsh treatment of their brother Israel, something like that. Because we want to include, brother, right? That's part of it. And then also the rebuke against them for their harsh treatment of it. And then obviously the theme of judgment is also here in the second paragraph. But notice the difference between the two paragraphs. Both of them focus on judgment, right? Judgment on Edom, but there's a different emphasis. You guys see that? In the first paragraph, it talks about Edom's pride and arrogance and loftiness. But in the second paragraph, the focus is on their violence against Israel. Okay, so you want to be able to pick that up and distinguish. But you see the author's flow of thought. Both paragraphs are talking about judgment, but the first one is against Edom's arrogance, and then the second paragraph is against how they were treated Israel. All right, any questions or comments on that? We're just trying to capture the focus idea in each of these paragraphs.
It could be used when there is a dispute in the church. Can we use it?
Well, we'll talk about how does this apply to the church. We'll talk about that at a later time, because that's further down in the process, right? We can't jump to that yet. Right now, all we're doing is trying to understand what the author is saying to, in the message here to his audience. And then later we'll see how does that apply to ours. Yeah, so don't use this if two people are fighting. You can't say, all right, God's going to bring judgment upon you. You'll be cut off forever. You'll be covered in shame forever. That's what the word of God says in Obadiah. Yeah, don't do that. Okay. Because again, here, God's addressing a pagan nation, right? He's not addressing believers. He's addressing a pagan nation who has committed violence against his people.
So, Pastor Tim, the prophets book or it can be used to evangelism to the unbelievers.
Certainly, yeah. Because, and by the way, that's a really good point, Kent, because in the very next paragraph, the last one, notice God says, the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. You see that? It's not just Edom that God pronounces judgment upon. Certainly Edom is the focus in this prophecy, because he talks about Edom here, right? No survivor, the house of Esau, possess the mountain of Esau. But God's judgment's coming not just upon Edom, but all the nations in the day of the Lord. All right. Now, we don't have time to summarize this third paragraph together, but I'll put it in your notes so you can look at it there. But basically, in the third paragraph, the idea is God will destroy Edom and restore Israel in the day of the Lord. Okay, so we see judgment continues, but there's this, notice the restoration of Israel is also brought in. On Mount Zion, there will be those who escape. The house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant in the last few verses. So here we have, again, God will destroy Edom. That's repeated, but also restore Israel in the day of the Lord. Okay. And I'll give you the main sentence in this paragraph is the day of the Lord draws near. And then throughout the paragraph, he discusses, again, judgment on Edom, but also he introduces the restoration of Israel in that same paragraph. Okay.
Pastor Tim, a question.
Yes.
A sort of clarification of what we are doing now. We will now focusing our assignment passage.
No, this is still looking at the book as a whole.
Okay.
Okay.
So what a happy day we have.
Well, here, let me I'll explain that to you for Zechariah, since that's the book we're studying together here.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. Thank you.
So let me see. For Zechariah, in fact, you notice I made a comment here because I knew Pastor German would say something, so I needed to make a comment.
Yes.
For the Zechariah assignment, just do paragraph summaries for chapters 1 to 6. Okay, the process we just did, do that for chapters 1 to 6. All right. Zechariah is broken up into 2 sections. Chapters 1 to 6 are the visions of Zechariah, which occur
chapter 7 to 14, the oracles.
Yeah, early in his ministry. But then chapters 7 and 8 occur a few years later, I think. And then chapters 9 to 14 occur after that. We don't know exactly when, but there's basically two sections. We have the visions of Zechariah, and then there's the oracles of Zechariah. Now, all I want you to do is chapters 1 to 6, go ahead and do paragraph summaries for each of those visions, okay? But in chapters 7 and 8, or 7 to 14, just summarize the whole chapter. Okay? That makes sense? So what you're going to have is like chapter 1, I don't remember the verses, but chapter 1, you may have, verses 1 to 5 and verses 6 to 17 and verses 18 to 21, something like that. Okay? And then chapter 2, you may have it broken down, all right, into, again, I don't know, the verses 1 to 4 and verses 5 to 10 or something like that. And then when you get to chapter 7, just summarize the chapter. You don't have to break it down in the paragraphs. And same for chapter 8. Summarize the chapter. Does that make sense? So it's still going to be some work, but our focus in the preaching labs, I gave you a message from chapters 1 to 6. All right, so that's why I want you to focus on those 6 chapters, do the paragraph summaries. Chapter 7 to 14, just summarize the whole chapter. So for example, chapter 7 might be Zechariah's message about fasting, something like that. Okay.
The false fasting.
Okay, something like that. But chapters 1 through 6, I want you to break down by the paragraphs in the chapter. So for example, we can even look at it here. Zechariah 1. Notice verses 1 to 6. Oh, sorry, you don't see this. I'm not showing you. Notice verses 1 to 6. He puts there and then we've got after that verses 7 through 11, because in the New American Standard they bold each paragraph, verses 7 to 11, and then verses 12 to 17. 7 to 11, 12. And then it's 18. So you got 4 paragraphs in chapter 1. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, verses 6 to 13, really. You just have 2 paragraphs in chapter 2. Okay? And I might, I'll probably put this down for you. I'll just give you the paragraphs in your assignment. All right. So just, I'll try by tomorrow to post the assignment with the example and the format and everything. So I'll just put for you the paragraphs for you to summarize. Okay. It'll be something like this.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
There's just 2 or it looks like just 2 or 3 paragraphs. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. 1, 2. Yeah, it looks like each chapter just has 2 or 3 paragraphs. 4. Okay. So it's not too bad. And just follow what we did for Obadiah. Identify the main sentence, look for the linked words, and then just come up with a summary sentence for that. Okay. All right. Well, time got away from us here. But hopefully that practice just reminded you of the process of doing this. Let me see. Do I want to? I'll save that for next week. I'll talk next week. Why are we doing this? What is the point of summarizing these paragraphs? So again, we're trying to follow the author's flow of thought. And what that does is allows us to see what his purpose is, what his focus is for the whole book. Okay. So next week, I want to talk about the author's purpose, because often looking at the flow of thought helps us to see what the author's purpose is. Why did he preach? Why did he write? What was the emphasis or focus of his message? All right. And so the author's flow of thought allows us to see that, because we're trying to get to the author's intent, right? We're trying to get to what was the author's message to his original audience. That's our goal. And so this process just kind of is a way to follow each of his points through the book. And then from that, hopefully, we'll see, what is his main idea or focus or purpose here in these. Because there's two things to keep in mind. There's the occasion of the book. That is what circumstances prompted the prophet to preach. And then there's the purpose of the book. That is, what is the message he's trying to deliver? Okay? So there's two parts to that. The occasion for the book and the purpose of the book. The occasion comes from the background context. The purpose comes from the literary context, the author's flow of thought. I'll cover that more next week, since it's already lunchtime here. But I'll post, Lord willing, tomorrow your assignment, the next assignment, which is the literary context of Zechariah. And I'll modify it a little bit, so you don't have to do the whole book, paragraph by paragraph, but do the first 6 chapters that way. And then the last 8 chapters you can do just summarize the whole chapter. Okay?
Yes. No, I understand that.
All right, so I'll show you that. I'll write that out explicitly on the assignment, which you'll find on Canvas. Again, Lord willing, hopefully I can post that tomorrow for you. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Any final comments or questions? Do you feel better, German, now? You feel a little better?
Feel better, yeah.
Okay. How's the chicken doing?
Feeling better.
German, I hope you will not follow Pastor JC. High blood pressure.
How's the chicken doing? What's the chicken think? Is that okay? The assignment okay for the chicken?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Okay.
That's Job's chicken, not Jose's chicken. The only one who did not abandon Job.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I know this morning was kind of more kind of an academic exercise a little bit, but this is a process that if you can, what I'm trying to help you do in the course of these modules is try to don't just look at passages in small bites. Obviously when we teach smaller sections, right? We'll teach a verse or a few verses, but don't, in your study, we don't just look at small pieces. We also understand how those pieces fit in the bigger piece. All right. And so I want you to be able to keep that in your minds all the time. How are these things connected? How's the author connecting all of these things? Because that's the context and that's what helps give understanding. And so
now I connect, Pastor Tim, the while I ask you a question about exhortation, about prophets.
Yes.
If it can get the whole context of the whole book, can you easily explain the text?
Yeah, and so for us, when we look at Obadiah, certainly the specifics of it are a message of judgment on the Edomites for what they did to Israel and for their arrogance. But beyond that, we can look at, okay, what was the underlying issue there? Well, how they treated their brother, and that God would vindicate Israel. And so this idea of God's vindication becomes a principle that not only was applied with Edom, but also we see that principle in all of Scripture, right? God vindicates himself and his people. And so that leads us to more of the principle, the timeless truth of the book that could apply to the church. But before we can get there, we have to see what was Obadiah saying to his hearers in the book first. And then once we understand that, and once we understand why he said that, then that links us to, okay, the timeless truths, which could apply more broadly. But first, we got to see, what is he saying to his audience? That's where it has to start. Okay, so this process we did this morning was just one of the steps to help us better understand what he was saying to his audience. Okay, and again, we've done that before. We did that with Philemon. You did that with Ephesians many years ago, right? When we started. And even in the narratives, we did that with John. You know, how do all of these stories link together in John, and how do they connect to the purpose of the book of John? So we're not doing anything new with the prophetic books at this stage. All right, the next step, when we focus on the passage, then we'll have some other things we'll need to do to approach the prophetic text. But for now, we're just looking at the author's message, his flow of thought through the book. All right?
Right.
All right, well, thank you for your patience, for your endurance. And just, I know this has been a very difficult year and a half now for all of us in different ways. And we want to remember the couple in Jesse's church, their family of the couple that recently died last week. So I'd like to take a minute, just pray for Jesse as he ministers to the family, and also for the family as they have suffered a loss from the virus. Okay, so I'll go ahead and pray to close our time this morning. Okay.